Today's gospel reading, or today's reading from Acts, ends up kicking off an interesting time for the early church. Now, you wouldn't think that one beggar getting healed would cause a whole slew of problems, but it does. See, this story picks up sometime after Pentecost. It's not really clear when, it's just one day Peter and John were walking in the temple. We don't know when that one day was, it just happened. But if you remember, things have been going pretty well for the early church ever since Jesus ascended. They had sat down and they had picked a replacement for Judas, so they had a full complement of 12 apostles again. They were all just kind of hanging out in the temple, singing and praising God all the time. And there was that one little day, 50 days after Easter, where they were all just kind of hanging out, and all of a sudden their hair caught fire, and they started speaking in tongues and prophesying, and long story short, the early church grew from 120 folk to 3,120 folk, all in the span of that day. So things are going pretty good for them. So Peter and John walk into the temple. They see a guy who's there begging who can't walk. Now, in those times, that was about the only occupation you could reasonably do when you couldn't walk was beg. So he's sitting there at the temple begging. He had been sitting at the temple there begging for long enough that people knew him as the beggar who can't walk and sat at the beautiful gate. And so Peter and John see him, and they go up to this man and they say, "Well, we don't have any money for you. How does walking sound?" It's kind of an interesting thing to offer a beggar who can't walk, right? We don't have money, but how would you like to walk? So Peter grabs him by the hand, helps him up, and not only is he walking around, but he's jumping around praising God. It's kind of cool, but unfortunately, this event kind of ruined the good times for the early church. Because the very next thing that happens, there's so many people that are so excited about this guy being healed that the Sanhedrin gets involved. And so Peter and John get, let's call it an invitation. It wasn't an invitation, but let's call it that to make it a little nicer sounding. So they get invited before the Sanhedrin and basically told to explain themselves. Now, if I'm Peter and John in this situation, I'm trying to figure out any way to get out of my encounter with the Sanhedrin, because if you remember, who is the group that worked hardest to get Jesus killed? The Sanhedrin. And now Peter and John are being summoned before them. It's a problem. And so Peter and John end up there, and instead of being scared or worried or frightened, they basically start preaching to them. They start telling the Sanhedrin about all of the cool stuff that Jesus did. And the Sanhedrin says, no, you guys really need to stop it with this whole talking about Jesus nonsense. And Peter basically looks right at them and says, no, not going to happen. Sorry. So they leave the Sanhedrin, and then they immediately go out and keep talking about Jesus, and 2,000 more people join the church that day. But then persecution ramps up again, or for the first time, rather. And this begins a cycle. Something cool happens, persecution ramps up. Something cool happens, persecution ramps up. Over and over and over again in the book of Acts, that's how it works. After this healing, persecution kicked off again. Some more folk are healed. Stephen ends up stoned by the Sanhedrin, but in the midst of his execution, he ends up preaching about God, which leads to the rise of Saul, who is the bigwig who is in charge of persecuting the Christian church, who ends up on the way to doing some persecution, meeting Jesus in the road in a blinding light, only to become a Christian, and then persecution ramps up again, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Now, what's really interesting to me about this cycle of cool thing, persecution, is how the disciples react to the persecution. Now, first, before we get there, I want to talk about something that might make a few of us not very happy with me. But it's something that I keep noticing, and it kind of drives me insane. The American church has developed for itself a bit of a persecution complex. We think that we're being persecuted all the time. We see things and something will happen, and I'll see Facebook explode about how our rights as Christians are being taken away. Now, I might be wrong here, but I don't think our lives as Christians are threatened in any way in this country. I might be wrong. I haven't experienced a lot of the persecution that people have claimed would be coming my way for being a pastor. But I hear these kinds of things all the time. Now, unfortunately, there's something that Christians in America have been doing when we have felt persecuted. And what we do is we fight back against the people who we think are persecuting us. That seems to be the reaction that we've been having lately. We feel that a group is threatening us as Christians, and so we fight back against them. The latest target for this is the LGBTQ folk. Christians have been doing a lot to fight back against what we see as persecution by them against us. Now, this is a touchy subject, and I'm trying to be very careful here. But I want to make a big distinction in how Americans have been reacting to what we perceive as persecution and what other Christians do when they experience persecution. I was able to find some stories of some Christians in Syria. There's a group, it's called, I wrote it down in here, Open Doors. And it's an organization that tries to fight against the persecution of Christians throughout the world. One of the things they do is they rank different places based on how dangerous it is to be a Christian there. But they also do interviews with Christians living in these regions. And I saw this interview of some Christians in Syria. And the interview was very interesting because they asked them, how many of your fellow Christians have fled Syria? And they're like, oh, well, quite a bit. How come you haven't left? And these are, the people that they interviewed are between 20 and 30 years old, mostly. And the response that they got was overwhelmingly, God has stuff for us to do here. They're in Syria, right? Syria is not the safest place for Christians right now. We've all heard the stories on the news of what is happening to Christians in Syria. And the response of these folk in Syria is, we're not leaving. We still have stuff for God that God has for us to do. So what have they been doing? They've been taking care of the people around them. They've been helping with rent. They've been helping with medical care. They've carrying on doing the work of the church, which is to love God first and love their neighbor second. And they also trust that God is going to protect them. They say the church is the reason for our survival. And through it all, they pray for peace. Their reaction is like that of the early disciples when they faced persecution. When the disciples were imprisoned, they stayed in prison unless God engineered a jailbreak for them. That happened 2 or 3 times, I think. And yet here in America, we fight back against things that don't threaten our lives. Whereas the Christians who are persecuted around the world just carry on being Christians. It's an example that they set for us, not fighting back against persecution with anger, but fighting back against persecution with love, with service. We should take for our examples those folk in Syria, those folk in other places around the world, and those early disciples who, when they faced persecution, they just considered it part of being a Christian. It was a sign for them that they were doing something right. If you've ever read stories of the early martyrs, it's fascinating. Because overwhelmingly, when they are killed for their faith, they go singing praises to God. I don't think I can do that. But I'd like for the Holy Spirit to turn me into someone who can. Because that is a witness. That is showing love. That is being a follower of Jesus. So that when we fight back against something that we see as persecuting us, our response is still to show the love of Jesus. The love of Jesus that said to those who were killing him, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing.